The scream cut through the rain before he even saw the water rising. He spun toward the sound, boots slipping in the mud as the wind shoved against him. The river had burst over the road, carrying broken branches and sheets of brown water that surged like a living thing. Something small fought in the current, rolling, twisting, dragged under and thrown up again. He dropped his pack and pushed forward, splashing through the flood as cold water slammed against his legs. Another cry rose, thinner this time, almost swallowed by the storm. He forced himself faster, breath sharp, eyes locked on the tiny shape tumbling between debris. For a moment it vanished, then the current spat it out again. He narrowed his focus, heart pounding. He couldn't tell if it was alive. He had spent years learning how to run toward danger, not away from it. He was walking a narrow rural path by the river, a place where farms stretched out behind broken fences and low fields now drowning under the storm. Rain hammered the ground in thick sheets, turning every step into a fight against the mud. Wind shoved at him hard enough to steal his breath. The flooded river thrashed beside him, carrying branches, debris, and pieces of torn crops. Then the cry came again, sharper this time, cutting through the roar of the storm. He didn't hesitate. He pushed forward. He stepped into the flood without thinking, the cold hitting him like a strike to the chest. The water pushed hard, dragging at his legs as he fought to stay upright. He moved sideways, using his hands to feel for stable ground, but the current kept shifting under him. A broken log slammed into his thigh, almost knocking him off balance. He pushed it away and kept going. He dropped to his knees when the water rose to his waist, crawling against the current, grabbing branches to pull himself forward. His fingers burned from the force of the debris scraping past. The cry came again, weaker now, somewhere ahead. He lifted his head and saw a small shape pinned between two thick branches, twisting helplessly as the current tried to pull it under. He forced himself closer, gripping the tangled wood. He pulled, slipped, pulled again. The branches refused to move, wedged deep in the mud beneath the surface. He braced his shoulder against them and pushed with everything he had. The water surged against him, cold and merciless. He reached out and grabbed the tiny shape, feeling it tremble in his hands. But something else was tangled with it. He freed the small body with one final push and dragged it against his chest, stumbling back toward the bank. The current tried to pull him down, but he kept moving until his boots hit solid ground. He collapsed onto the wet soil, breathing hard, rain running down his face and mixing with the dirt on his hands. His forearm throbbed where a branch had cut him, a thin line of red, already washed clean by the storm. For a moment, everything went quiet except his own heartbeat. He looked down at the tiny creature lying against his jacket. It was a piglet, soaked, shivering, barely moving. As he brushed the mud from its neck, something caught the light. A mark, faint but deliberate. He leaned closer, trying to understand it. He thought it was over until he saw the mark on its neck. He lifted the piglet gently and turned it so he could see the mark more clearly. It wasn't just a bruise or a scratch. Something thin and metallic was pressed against its skin, half hidden under the wet fur. He eased it free with careful fingers. A tiny tag slipped into his palm, cold even through the heat of his hand. It was oval, worn smooth at the edges, the surface scratched by time and mud. A thin piece of frayed string had once held it around the piglet's neck. He rubbed away the dirt with his thumb. Letters appeared first, carved in hurried strokes, as if they had made them with whatever tool they had. Below the letters was a number, and under that a faint date nearly erased by water and sand. He squinted at it, trying to match the symbols to anything he remembered, but they refused to form a clear meaning. He looked back at the piglet, wondering who had put this on such a tiny animal and why it had been left in the middle of a storm. The letters seemed familiar, but he couldn't place them. The number looked important, yet meant nothing to him. And the date, barely readable, stopped him cold. The date scratched on it made no sense. He slipped the tiny tag into his pocket, feeling its weight far more than its size. The details on it kept replaying in his mind, refusing to settle. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a stray mark left by a farmer trying to keep track of livestock before the storm hit. But the letters and the date kept pulling at him like a thread he didn't want to tug. As he held the piglet close, a familiar unease stirred inside him. He had learned long ago that coincidences were rarely simple. They had a way of dragging the past back into the present, whether he was ready for it or not. The flood, the cry, the strange tag on a helpless creature. It felt like something was pushing him towards a truth he had tried to leave behind.
He stood slowly, steadying himself against the wind. The piglet trembled in his arms, its breathing shallow but steady. He looked at it for a long moment, reminded of a line someone once told him, "Saving one life saves your own." He had never believed it then. He didn't know if he believed it now. But he knew he couldn't ignore this. Not the animal, not the tag, not the feelings settling deep in his chest. He turned toward the road, the rain easing just enough for him to see ahead. He would get the piglet warm and safe first. Then he would find out what the mark meant. He would investigate, no matter where it led. He reached a small shed near the edge of the village, a place he used when storms made the road impossible. Inside, the air was quiet and warm compared to the chaos outside. He set the piglet on an old blanket and began drying its fur with a towel, moving slowly so it would not panic. The little body shook at first, then eased as the warmth wrapped around it. He found a shallow bowl, poured some milk, and watched the piglet sniff it before taking a few weak sips. The rhythm of the moment softened everything. The storm faded into a distant hum. His breaths matched the piglet's small breaths. When he reached out to check its temperature, it pressed its head lightly against his hand, as if trusting him without question. That simple gesture stayed with him. Night settled over the shed. The piglet slept curled in the blanket. But he didn't sleep. He sat by the small lamp, the tiny tag resting on his palm. The letters, the number, the impossible date, none of it fit together. None of it should have been there at all. It shouldn't exist, but it did. He pulled out an old box he had kept tucked beneath the work table, a box he had avoided opening for years. Inside were the pieces of a life he no longer talked about. Faded papers, torn photos, a few worn notebooks from days he wished he could forget. He set the tag beside them and began searching. He flipped through pages stained by time, scanning names, numbers, and dates that once meant everything to him. At first, nothing connected. Then he found a page from an old report, its ink smudged but still readable. The initials were there, the same 3 letters carved into the tiny tag. Under them was a date he hadn't thought about in a long time, the same date scratched onto the metal in his pocket. He stared at it, feeling something shift inside him. The piglet wasn't random. The storm hadn't simply carried it to him. This mark belonged to someone he once knew, someone he owed more than words could cover, someone whose memory he had tried to bury for years. His hand tightened around the tag as the truth settled over him like a slow, heavy wave. The letters matched a name he had erased. He sat back in the chair, holding the tag as if it might crumble in his hands. The memories he had spent years locking away began to rise, slow and uninvited. He saw faces he had not allowed himself to remember, heard voices that had faded into silence. The initials on the tag belonged to a man who once stood beside him, a man he could not save when everything went wrong. The guilt he thought he had buried pressed against his chest again, as sharp as the day it happened. He looked over at the piglet, sleeping on the blanket. Its breathing was steady now, soft and calm. It had fought for life with every bit of strength it had, even when the flood tried to take it. He wondered why it had ended up in his path, why it carried a mark tied to a part of his life he never expected to face again. He touched the tag and felt the truth settle in a way he could no longer avoid. Saving one life saves your own. He had brushed off that idea for years, telling himself he did not need saving, telling himself he was fine living with the weight he carried. But sitting there in the quiet shed, watching a creature that had trusted him without hesitation, he felt something shift inside him. The piglet woke and lifted its head, blinking at him before taking a shaky step towards his boots. It nudged his leg gently, as if sensing the storm inside him. He exhaled, a slow breath he didn't know he had been holding. The tiny animal mirrored everything he felt: fear, exhaustion, and the fragile hope of beginning again. He closed his fingers around the tag, not to hide it this time, but to face what it meant. Maybe this rescue wasn't an accident. He walked to the edge of the old riverbank the next morning, the sky clear after the storm. The piglet followed beside him, steadier on its feet now, its fur dry and its steps confident. He reached the place where the water had once taken more from him than he could bear. The ground was soft, marked by time and memory. He knelt and set the tag on a smooth stone, letting it rest in the quiet it had always deserved. The piglet paused beside him, looking out at the river with a calm he hadn't seen before. He placed a hand gently on its back, a simple gesture of protection and thanks. Saving one life saves your own. He understood it now, not as a lesson, but as something he had lived through. He stood and took a step away from the stone. The piglet lingered for a moment, then turned as if ready to choose its own path. He watched it walk toward the open field, sunlight catching its small frame. He didn't call it back. Sometimes the smallest life can remind you of the strength you thought you had lost. Saving one life saves your own. In the quiet that followed, he felt a weight lift that he had carried for too long, and the world around him seemed a little softer, a little more forgiving. A distant rustle drifted across the field, carried by the soft morning wind. He turned his head, listening, sensing another story waiting somewhere beyond the trees. He let the moment settle, calm and open, as the day slowly breathed to life around him.